How to make an antique style leather spyglass case. The first thing I did was remove the nasty plastic wrapper on the brass spyglass. Then I took some black leather and cut it to the appropriate size, just so that it would wrap around the spyglass and the edges would just touch. Then I used my sewing machine to sew 2 lines of stitching. I put a dab of super glue at the start of each stitching line to prevent it coming apart. Now, it's not essential, but I used double-sided sticky tape just like this to prevent a lateral movement when I was sewing. I'd recommend this if you're only going to be using 1 needle, but I did it just for an extra measure. Yeah, in fact, the rubber bands are probably more than sufficient. Then I started sewing. I put a stitch right across the 2 top holes, as you can see there, and then I started to sew in and out, crisscrossing all the way down, finessing with the thumb as I went, and just making sure that I'm being as consistent as possible. It was a bit fiddly with the camera getting in the way, but I think you get the idea. The idea is to try and get the cross part to match just where the line of the leather joins. I finished the stitching line just as in the same way that I had started it, and I tied it off and buried the knot. The next task was to find a suitable tube. Now, PVC piping is a really good option. It's extremely strong, it's cheap, and it will definitely do the job. I found this piece, but it was slightly larger than what I hoped for. But then in the house, I found a cardboard tube, which was from an old fabric roll. And this isn't like a toilet roll. It's really quite strong, it's sturdy, and it will stand up to the job once prepared properly. So I prepared the cardboard tube by infusing it with Mod Podge and then spraying it black and then spraying clear coat over the top so it looks like a lacquered piece of wood. Now I can judge the length of the tube that I need and mark it off and cut it. Next I took some leather. This is about 4mm vegetable tanned leather. And I started cutting it to the size that I needed. The length was already decided because I needed 2 or 3 centimeters for the cap part to be exposed, as you see here. So the difficult part was wrapping it around the tube and getting it just the right size. So take your time doing this. So it's really the same method that I used to wrap the spyglass, and one difference is because this is such thick leather, I'm beveling the inside edges that I indicate here so that the edges will roll together when they're being stitched. I used the groover at about 3mm from the bottom of the leather. This is going to be a guide for when I do in the box stitch. It's not essential, but the lip that is produced by the groover gives me something real to work with when I'm judging where the holes should go. Again, I used the sewing machine to produce 2 lines of stitching and fastened the beginnings and ends of the lines with super glue on the back of the leather. Crisscross stitching all the way from the top to the bottom. You shouldn't have to force anything, but you do need to apply some pressure in order to make sure that the leather really does pull together and that the stitches are consistent. So this was only my second time attempting something like this, and so it's not perfect, but I'm reasonably happy with the results. Tie off and bury the knot just as before. Now we need to make 2 circles for the top and bottom of the case, and the method that I recommend is to using one of these compass style cutters, which are designed really for craft, paper craft and light cardboard, but actually do a remarkably good job even with thick leather like this. And we need some options for avoiding a prick hole as we cut the circles. And one way, of course, is to cut from the underside of the leather, but that doesn't work so well with very thin leather. So I came up with a method which involves cutting a small circle. It's about 2 centimeters in diameter out of PVC. That's that white disc you see here. And then on the underside is a sandwich. In the center of the sandwich is a broken craft knife. And then on the outer edge is a special material, which I'll give a link to in the description. It's actually a microsuction pad, which actually adheres itself to the surface of the leather without damaging it. It's actually less damaging than something like masking tape, which can damage the surface of the leather, which I've tried. And I used the same method to produce 2 collars out of black leather. There's one that you can see here. So I've cut the outer edge of the circle and then cut an inner circle to make a ring out of leather at just the right size. So this forms a collar and covers up any of the raw edge of the leather at the top, and I think it just gives it a more finished look. One of the hardest things that I found was creating a groove line along the edge of the top pieces, top circles of leather. Maybe you have more luck than I do using a groover. It always sort of like catches and skips, and it doesn't give a straight line or perfectly circular line. So one method that I found slightly better was to cut a circle out of PVC and then use a craft knife just to, not a craft knife, a modeling tool to indent around the edge so that I get a more even looking groove line. And I find this difficult because that groove needs to be right on the edge, because I've only got 4 millimeters sort of clearance in order to, I don't want it far from the edge because I want direct holes going down into the leather tube piece. So I find this quite tricky. I then used a 2-prong hole punch just to mark out where I need the holes in that groove. And you could punch through yourself, or what I prefer to do is to use the sewing machine for different reasons. One, it's completely silent. Secondly, I know it gives a completely perpendicular hole, and actually the hole is slightly smaller produced by the needle than the hole punch, so I prefer to use the sewing machine, but certainly it is an option to punch through. So on the underside of those discs, I'm adding a circle of black leather that was left over from making the collar pieces, and this is going to add some stability and strength right at the end. It's like a plug, and so that's going to be glued, as you see here. And it's going to be perfectly centered because I'm using the cardboard tube to make sure that it centers it just right. Push it down, press it into place, and the contact cement will keep it rock solid. It's not essential, but I like it because it makes the end have no give at all. So that fits perfectly. And I can start with box stitching. So the top holes are already done. It's a matter of lining up the awl to meet with those holes, and I like to start near to where I did the stitching lines, because at the end it'll make it easier to tie off and hide the knot. So I'm no expert at box stitching. As I say, this is only the second time that I've done this, but if the top holes have been made correctly, then this is relatively easy, at least to get the kind of results that I was getting. I'm using quite a wide awl here. I have a smaller one, but I don't know. I lack the techniques, so I found this one easier to use. But I'm saddle stitching, using 2 needles all the way around. And it's a matter of keeping an eye on the spacing, but trying to make sure that it is directly in line with the hole which is on the top. You just push the needle in as much as you need to and not beyond that, because you don't want to stretch the leather or to make a hole bigger than you need. And what I found was that well, obviously using the thicker leather makes it easier. Anything less than 2.5 millimeter I would find very tricky. And the stiffer the leather, the better. So this is really, I think it's from the shoulder part of the cow. I think it's really kind of stiff leather. That's going to make it easier, because if you're using belly, vegetable tan from the belly of the cow, then it could be a bit too spongy. But you work your way around, and as always, tie off and bury the knot. So you get a better view from here. I'm lining it up, and the needle goes straight through. No effort at all, really. And I should mention, I have waxed this thread using some beeswax. I just melted some beeswax, and between my fingers, just along the length of the thread, it makes it go through a bit easier. Then I repeated the whole process for the cap, and the only difference was I used a line of sort of insulating tape, electrical insulating tape, across the back of the stitches, in order to make it easier for it to slip in and out. Because I'd used super glue to secure the stitches, it could be a bit of a rough edge there, so I used the insulating tape to smooth that out. The collar piece, the black leather ring, was glued in place. Now I could have saddle stitched that. I could have box stitched that as well, but that would have been an extra level of work, and so maybe I'd attempt that next time. But I think it will stay secure as it is. And then your project is done. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more free tutorials and pattern downloads.